again. Thank you for joining me. We're going to talk today, as I said last week, about gnomes. Now, it's been a little while since I did a video on the sort of factions from the woods. We've been doing lots of White Dwarf reviews, some looking at Warhammer stuff, some sort of day-to-day running of business stuff, but we haven't talked a lot about rules, so I thought it'd be nice to go back to talking a little bit about how the game plays and perhaps some tactical choices. And gnomes are one that has come up a couple of times in the past as a kind of unworkable faction. It's one of the downsides when you're creating a game to realistically portray, in fantasy terms, to realistically portray a race, a type of creature that is not necessarily going to be balanced against other types. So we're striving for a degree of balance in that different warbands will be able to achieve different things with different capabilities, but ultimately this is about sort of portraying how a type of creature acts and performs in their setting. So there isn't necessarily going to be balance, and gnomes are one of those hard ones where actually the balance is a little bit tipped away from their favour. They are at a disadvantage. I will be honest with that. They are. They're expedition armies. If you're playing in battle mode, though, they're good. So we've alleviated this a little bit with the article that's in the almanac that I talked about last week, allowing them to take the guild weapons, the flamethrowers and the big reflective armour and the horns. So that helps for sure. But yeah, there are some difficulties. So gnomes, if you're not familiar with gnomes from the rulebook, a little overview of gnomes. Gnomes are the administrative force of the Fey Empire. So when the Fey were sort of ruling Talavlar, they didn't want to be bothered with the day-to-day running of things, the administration, so they left that to the gnomes, and the gnomes enjoyed that because they're very organised, methodical, logical, thinking people. So they were totally fine to be running things, and in fact they were so wrapped up with running things that the Fae had actually left the Empire for a few cycles before the gnomes realised that they weren't there, and they'd run out of orders to fulfill. The gnomes have this kind of psychological, spiritual view of the universe, which is that it's made up of three elements: heat and light and sound, hence flamethrowers and reflective armour and big horns. And they think that the universe needs to be kept in balance between these three elements, so no one element should be allowed to take ascendancy. And they split their society into three guilds. There's Guild Backer, who are responsible for maintaining levels of heat. There's Guild Baitit, which are responsible for maintaining levels of light, and there's Guild Gietna, who are involved in the balance of sound energy. And these three guilds have a bit of a kind of rivalry between them. Hence, when you're endorsed by a guild, you can only really be endorsed by one guild at a time, otherwise the others get a bit funny about it. And where the gnomes live in Mount Silence, which was the former administrative capital, the mines underneath are infested with former goblin slaves, and so the Ascendant guild is the one that is currently responsible for managing the goblin problem. I think it says, I'm trying to remember, it's a long time since I wrote this, I'm trying to remember if it says, I think currently it's Guild Gietna. that are responsible. It's currently a noise. It's seen as being a noise issue, but the guilds are continuously trying to make it another guild's problem, make the goblins another guild's problem. So they might make out that actually at some point it's a heat issue. The goblins are creating too much heat, or the goblins are draining too much heat. Or they could say that it's a light issue, but I think at the moment they're saying it's a noise issue. The goblins are too noisy doing what they're doing, so it's up to Guildjet to sit on them and deal with that problem. Anyway, so that's where we are with the gnomes. They are not a go out there and fight people race, which is part of the reason why they're at a disadvantage. Although they do have a decent amount of strength, they're actually, if you count up their stat line, they're above average performers, but they have one very significant issue, and that's their agility, which is 1. So if you play the game, you'll be aware that there are that these characteristics impact different abilities in terms of what a model can do on the tabletop. So if your agility is 1, your biggest impact is on movement. Because they've got a courage of 2, that gives them a regular walk move of 3 inches, but it gives them a maximum sprint move of 4 inches. So their maximum sprint movement is the same as a regular 2-2 model's normal movement. So they are slow. They are not getting anywhere in a hurry. And they're average with missile capabilities, but they don't come as standard equipped with any missile equipment. So it's difficult really engaging with other warbands when they're moving around fast, particularly something like Mieri, or something like Fae, where they're disappearing from one place and popping up somewhere else, or someone who's got a lot of animals, perhaps someone who's got wolves or boars or something in tow. It's hard keeping up with those warbands, so that is a significant disadvantage, and that's what a lot of people are finding with the gnomes. The reason for that is not because they are little short people with little short legs. Okay, maybe that's part of the reason, but that's not the reason why they have their agility 1. The reason their agility 1 is their kind of nature. So they are thinking, calculating, very careful people. Now, they actually have higher than average decisiveness. Even your regular gnome is a point higher in decisiveness than an average Tuatha. And your leader's several points above that. So they're likely going to be going early, and we'll talk about another skill that allows them to boost that even further. They're likely to be going early in a round, so they are decisive, and that's because once they get to that point where they're involved in a game, they've got a plan, they know what they're doing. The agility is because within that plan, they're obviously being quite careful and methodical and very precise about what they're doing. So they're doing everything really, really well, but they're doing it really, really slowly. And so yeah, that does give them issues on the tabletop. Now, as with all limiting factors, choosing objectives is going to be really quite crucial to making the most of them. So if I turn to the objectives part of my rulebook that I've got here for reference, there are definitely going to be objectives that gnomes can do better than others. So you're not, for example, probably going to be very good at totems, erecting totems around the board, because you're going to need to spread out thinly, and it's going to take you a long time to get far enough apart from the rest of the warband in order to do that. Similarly, something like a Horde, where you're trying to get into the middle of the board and out again, or something like Guardians. Well, actually, we'll talk about Guardians later, but something like maybe Escape, where you're trying to get across the board. That's not going to be a thing that a slow gnome is going to want to do, probably. within 12 game turns, it's definitely possible for a gnome to move all the way across the board. They're just obviously going to be quite careful with it, and you may not get much in the way in encounters beforehand, but your ability to stop your opponent doing what they're doing at the same time is going to be very limited. They're going to be just going for that objective, which is very gnomic. You know, that's what they do. They pick a thing and they go for it, but yeah, their ability to interfere with other people along the way is going to be limited. What they are quite good at doing are things like observe and counting coup and steal to an extent. We'll talk about steal and guardians in a moment, but so something like observe particularly, which makes use of a reasonable amount of perception, and the model then escaping with it, means that you don't actually have to get very close to your enemies in order to do it. You can sneak up, watch them sneak away again, and gnomes are quite good at sneaking for a reason that I'll talk about in a moment. Same with counting coup. They've got above average strength, so they're going to hold their own in a fight, particularly if they're not spending a lot of their stamina on movement, if they're just going to sit somewhere, which actually makes something like guardians quite possible as well. If they can get there, if you can get into the right spot, and it's a small area in the centre of the battlefield, so it's difficult to get there ahead of your enemies. But if you can get there ahead of your enemies, they're going to sit there and they're not going to let anyone else take advantage of it. So that because you've got leather jacks on them, so they're going to absorb some damage. Some of the gnome models have quarterstaffs, so they can hold people off at a distance, and their good strength means, although it's brought down a bit by their low agility, that brings their fighting strength down a little bit as well. But overall, having the higher strength means you've got the higher capacity to get a bigger score there. You're not limited by the maximum fight score. So so they can hold their own in a fight reasonably well, and yeah, they may not they're not going to go in there and trounce somebody in the first turn, but they'll be sitting there, and they may be losing by a point each turn, but it's still going to take 3 turns in order for a hit to happen, to land on them. If they're equaling and going down a point each turn, it's going to take 3 rounds for them to sit there, and then their leatherjack is going to be absorbing some of the damage. So avoid big nasty weapons, but you can sit there and take hits from regular troops quite comfortably for a little while, especially if it's near the end of the game. And for that reason also counting coup is useful, because all you've got to do is win around a grappling. You haven't got to be able to inflict any damage, so winning by point is sufficient to do that. You have then got to get away, and this is where a couple of things within the gnome skills are useful. So let's take a look at some of the gnomes' special skills. Your Dutki, your leader, has quite a lot of capacity to be modified, and his modifications are not cheap. Some of the things are 5 points to specialise, but there's a lot of range. As a leader, they're quite a flexible, customisable troop, so you can do a few things with those. But then your really useful thing comes with the actual troops themselves. So the Mutati, firstly, they're single-minded, so they have this ability to nominate something that they want to do and something that they want to do it against, and then they count as being very high decisiveness until they do that thing. So they're set on that one thing. They're going to go and do that thing. So that gives them that capacity to just head for that objective. And the second thing that they have is their authority, which lets them give orders to models that couldn't otherwise receive orders, and that includes models that are in a grapple. So if you've got grappling gnomes and you've got Mutati nearby, you can order those gnomes to get out of that grapple again. So if you're counting coup, you can get them out of harm's way before it gets to a second round. Or if you are really going for it, you can order them to get out and back into that combat and potentially get another round of hits in. If you've got a weakened opponent, an opponent with no stamina remaining, you can get repeated hits within a single turn by using that order system. So that's kind of handy, as long as the Matati themselves aren't engaged. If you can keep them kind of back and separate, then that's useful. The Lizarti have their quarterstaffs, so they're useful things to have in that position because they can hold people off at a distance, which just gives them that bit of extra capacity to get out again, which is especially useful given their low agility. Starting off that 2-inch distance from with a quarterstaff is going to make the difference between being able to get out of Hock or not. But the Vahenti are the thing that I really want to pick up on, because their light fingers camouflage combination makes them potentially really useful in steal objectives, and in fact in counting, not counting coup, in observe objectives, because their camouflage means that as long as they're standing in base contact with some item of terrain which is bigger than they are, so a hedge or a tree or a rock or something, they can't be targeted, they can't be seen, they blend into their background. So that means that as long as you've got a battlefield that's got lots of items around it, lots of scenic items, and they can get from one to the other, they can actually make their way across the battlefield without really anyone being able to target them, unless they're within perception range, in which case they can see them. So it's not a complete fail-safe, but if you can stay distant enough from your enemy that they can't see you, then it's quite easy to just observe from the sidelines and then get out again. So that makes the observe quite a useful skill, and they're not that expensive. You're looking at a few points per model higher than Tuatha, so you're going to have a warband of maybe 8-10, depending on how many extra recruitment points you take with your leader. So you're going to have quite a big warbands. You can have them spread in groups, travelling in groups for support. What they're also really good at is coercion. And I know this is something that not a lot of people engage with because perhaps it's a little bit arcane, but if you can get your head around how the coercion stuff works, it's a really useful part of the game in terms of influencing stuff that appears to be pretty nasty, hard-hitting. All gnomes have an extra point of wisdom and an extra point of strength, which gives them immediately 2 points of presence up on every other model. Which means that they can order a further distance, which is good. They can be slightly further apart and still shout at each other. But it also means that they have their 2 points of menace up on a regular person to start off with. So intimidation suddenly becomes actually a lot more possible, especially if you've got groups of gnomes clustered around. They can intimidate. And they also, they're a point up on their charisma, so charming is also more useful or more effective as a gnome than it is as a regular troop type. So on both those counts, on menace and on charm, you're already in there with a better chance of being able to intimidate or coerce, charm your opponent's pieces. So there's a manipulative factor there with the gnomes. They are able to reason and move other troops around. So if you can get close enough to bring those into play, then so much the better. So for gnomes, they're going to take a long time to get anywhere, but when they get somewhere, they're going to be effective. So it's trying to make sure that your late game strategy, because it's going to be potentially 6 turns before you're anywhere nearby, and fast warbands will probably have completed an objective in that time, which is not is not necessarily very interesting if you're just moving forwards and fast warbands are coming back the other way, which is why the guild endorsements do bring an extra things to do in early game that are a bit more interesting for the gnomes. But if a gnome warband can hold out until the mid to late game, then especially if they're able to sort of trap opponents' models on the board, or they're able to then claim an objective late in the game, then they can be effective. But yeah, I would say they are definitely at a disadvantage. They're a difficult warband to play. They're a difficult warband to make work. Of course, as with the Fey limiting capacity on strength, the moment that you've recruited your warband, you are able to do something development-wise that negates their inherent weakness. So with Fey, their inherent weakness is their strength. They have a strength of 1, which limits their fighting capacity. But as soon as you've recruited that warband, as soon as you've got some XP in the bank, you can up that stat, and it's cheap to do so because of the way that characteristic advancements sort of multiply exponentially. It's really quite cheap to boost from 1 to 2. I think it's a 4-point it's a 4-point raise. So you've only got to get 5 XP in a game, and one of your gnomes can suddenly move up to 2 and agility 2, and then they're walking. They're back to a standard regular walk of 4 and a sprint of 8, same as everything else. And then their fighting is at 5, and given the extra ability to go higher because of their higher strength. So in campaign terms, the first few games focus on trying to get enough objective or enough XP to boost one of your models, possibly 2 of your models, and then in the next game use those 2 models to get further, get more points, and then maybe you're upgrading 2 or 3 after the end of it. So it can be that within 4 games you actually have a warband that's potentially more effective than other warbands that are in the campaign, because boosting that 1-point characteristic to a 2-point characteristic, which combines with the 3 of the strength to give you a boosted combat ability, is quicker for you than boosting a 2-point stat to a 3-point stat to give the same result. So starting with that strong strength and a lower agility just means that you're at a disadvantage initially, but you can upgrade quicker than other warbands. So you may find that the gnomes find out how to do stuff faster and become capable a lot quicker, which again fits with the gnome characteristics. They're always sort of observing and watching and working out how to do things better. So they're going to perhaps be better at that than some of the other warbands. So if you are running a gnome warband, stick with it. Put up with a frustrating couple of games, but choose those objectives. Maybe play with the camouflage and the manipulation a little bit, and hold fire, because a few games in, if you're playing a campaign, a few games in, you're going to find that you start to gain an edge on other warbands. So stick with it. Hope that's useful. And if you're facing a gnome warband, kill them off. Don't let gnomes survive without horrific injuries. You need to be inflicting injuries on them to keep those stats down, so that they don't escalate, and make them recruit new gnomes that are slow starters, because the moment they start developing, they're going to be getting an edge on you. So yeah, kill the gnomes. It's a very goblin-y thing to do. Hope that's been useful. Hope that's been interesting. Join us next week for, I think we're going to do some more White Dwarfs, because it'll be May. I shall see you then. Take care.